I never thought delivering meal kits would lead to something like this. It was supposed to be an easy gig. You pick up boxes of pre-packaged meals, drop them off at nice homes, wave to the homeowners if they're around, and head out for the next delivery. It's straightforward, and with the growing popularity of meal kits, there was never a shortage of shifts. Most days I didn't think much about the job. I was just a cog in the machine, helping busy people cook healthy at home. But that was before the day I realized I wasn't just delivering food. I was unknowingly delivering something far worse. It all started with a normal Friday route. I was working the affluent neighborhoods near 675 Ponce de Leon Ave, Nebraska in Atlanta. If you've been around that area, you know the kind of places I'm talking about. Beautiful homes, manicured lawns, the type of people who drive Teslas and Priuses. My car was loaded up with meal kits for half a dozen families in the area, each box packed with neatly portioned ingredients and recipe cards for their dinners that week. One of the stops was at the Chen family's home, a 2-story brick house with a little garden out front. Mr. Chen usually wasn't around when I delivered, but I saw his wife sometimes, busy with the kids. Today, though, it was Mr. Chen who opened the door. He greeted me with a smile as I handed him the box. "Hey Samantha, how's it going?" he asked casually. His 2 kids, a boy and a girl, peeked out from behind him giggling. "Same old," I said with a grin. "Busy day?" He laughed. "Always. Thanks for the delivery. The kids are really into these kits. They love helping out in the kitchen." I smiled, waved to the kids, and headed back to my car. Little did I know that this would be the last normal interaction I'd have with Mr. Chen, or with anyone else in that neighborhood, for a long time. The first signs of trouble didn't come until the next day. I had just finished another round of deliveries when I got a message from the app's customer service team. Something about a report of food poisoning linked to one of the meal kits. I didn't think much of it at first. People can get sick from all kinds of things, and it's not like I had anything to do with the food once it left my hands. But then another report came in, and another. By the end of the day, 3 families had reported severe food poisoning after using their meal kits, and each of them had been on my delivery route the previous day. My stomach twisted in knots as I realized this wasn't just a random coincidence. The pattern was clear. All of the sick families had received their meal kits from me. I tried to shrug it off. Maybe it was just bad luck, a freak accident. I wasn't the one packing the food after all. My job was just to drop it off, but something didn't sit right with me. The families that were affected, they were all in the same neighborhood, close to each other, and one of them was the Chens. I kept checking my phone for updates, hoping that maybe the whole thing would blow over, but by the end of the night it only got worse. The next morning I woke up to an email that hit me like a ton of bricks. The subject line read, "Urgent delivery issue reported, possible contamination." My stomach flipped as I opened the message. It was from Dr. Reynolds, a CDC investigator working on a possible outbreak linked to meal kit deliveries. The email was short, but it cut right to the point. They wanted to speak with me about the deliveries I had made in the past few days. They were investigating multiple reports of foodborne illnesses that all traced back to kits I had delivered. I stared at the screen, my hands shaking. Contamination? Foodborne illnesses? This was way beyond anything I'd ever dealt with. I had delivered dozens of boxes over the past few days. If something was wrong with the kits, it could mean more families were in danger. I called the number in the email, and after a few minutes of being transferred from one department to another, I finally got through to Dr. Reynolds. "Samantha, thanks for getting back to us." His voice came through the phone, calm but serious. "I'm sure you've seen the reports. We're dealing with a potential contamination issue in your delivery area, and we need your help to trace the source." "Yeah, I've seen the reports," I said, my voice trembling. "But I don't understand. How could this happen?" "I just deliver the boxes. I don't pack them." Dr. Reynolds sighed. "We're not saying you're responsible, Samantha, but you're the link between all the affected families. We're trying to determine if there's a specific batch or delivery window that was compromised. Can you tell us if you noticed anything unusual during your deliveries?" I thought back to the last couple of days. Everything had seemed normal, but the more I thought about it, the more something nagged at the back of my mind. There was something strange, One of the boxes I'd picked up felt off. I remember because I almost dropped it. It had been slightly heavier than the others, and when I picked it up, something inside shifted, like it wasn't packed the same way. Actually, I said slowly, there was one delivery that seemed weird. The box felt heavier, and it wasn't packed like the others. It was for the Chen family. Dr. Reynolds was silent for a moment before speaking again. That's important information. We need to know exactly when and where you picked up that box. Can you remember? I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. Yeah, it was from the warehouse on Ponce de Leon. The order was packed when I got there. I didn't think anything of it at the time. Dr. Reynolds made a note of it, then his tone grew more urgent. Samantha, I need you to keep your phone on. We're sending someone to meet you. We may need your help tracking this further. We believe the contamination may be deliberate. Deliberate. That word echoed in my head long after the call ended. This wasn't just some random contamination. Someone had tampered with the meal kits, and families, people I had delivered to, were getting sick because of it. It wasn't just food poisoning. It was something much more sinister. A couple of hours later, I met Dr. Reynolds in person at the CDC's temporary office in Atlanta. He was a tall, serious-looking man in his 40s, with a sharp gaze that told me he wasn't someone who messed around. He had a small team with him, all of them wearing badges that made the whole thing feel more official and more terrifying. We've traced the contamination to specific ingredients in certain kits, Dr. Reynolds explained as we sat down in a small meeting room. The pattern suggests tampering. We're working with law enforcement to investigate the source. My mind raced as he spoke. Tampering? Who would do something like that, and why? We believe it may be an inside job, he continued. Someone with access to the packing process. The contamination is targeting specific families who all use the same delivery service. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. But why target them? What do these families have in common? Dr. Reynolds looked at me carefully. That's what we're trying to figure out. We think the perpetrator has a personal grudge, possibly against certain customers or the company itself. We need to stop this before anyone else gets hurt. I felt sick. The Chens, the other families, they were all just normal people, trusting that the food I delivered would be safe. And now, because of someone's twisted plan, they were suffering. What do you need me to do? I asked, my voice shaky but determined. We need you to help us retrace your deliveries, Dr. Reynolds said. Show us the exact routes, the pickup points, anything you remember about the packaging or the people you interacted with. For the next few hours, I walked Dr. Reynolds and his team through every detail of my deliveries. We mapped out the routes, checked the timestamps, and reviewed the packaging information. It was exhausting, but I knew it was important. We had to find out who was behind this. A few days passed with no major breakthroughs. Every day, I anxiously checked my phone, hoping for news that the contamination had been traced and the person responsible had been caught. But nothing. Then, late one night, I got a call from Dr. Reynolds. His voice was tense. We found something, Samantha. We need you to come down to the warehouse on Ponce de Leon right away. When I arrived, the warehouse was crawling with investigators. Dr. Reynolds met me at the entrance, his expression grim. We've identified the source, he said quietly. It's an employee, a man named Lucas Bennett. He's been working here for 6 months, but he has a history with some of the customers on your route. I stared at him, my heart pounding. What do you mean, a history? Bennett used to work in customer service for the meal kit company, Dr. Reynolds explained. He had several complaints filed against him for unprofessional behavior, mostly from customers in the more affluent neighborhoods. After Dr. Reynolds took a deep breath and continued, after being reassigned to the warehouse, we believe Bennett started targeting specific families. He's been adding contaminants to certain kits, focusing on customers who had previously filed complaints against him. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. So this was personal? Dr. Reynolds nodded. Very much so. He kept track of the customers who had complained about him while he worked in customer service, and when he was reassigned, he saw it as an opportunity for revenge. We think he's been tampering with the ingredients in the meal kits sent to those specific families. My mind was racing. The Chins had never seemed like the type to complain. They were always friendly whenever I saw them. But then again, who knew what went on behind the scenes? Maybe they had filed a complaint that set Bennett off, unknowingly becoming his targets. "Have you arrested him?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. Dr. Reynolds sighed and shook his head. "Not yet. He didn't show up for his shift today and his home address is fake. But we're working with law enforcement to track him down. It's only a matter of time." I stood there in stunned silence, trying to process everything. This was more than just a job gone wrong. It was a nightmare. Innocent families, including the Chens, had been poisoned because of some guy's vendetta. And I had delivered the contaminated kits right to their doorsteps without knowing it. "How bad is it?" I asked quietly, not really wanting to know the answer but needing to hear it anyway. Dr. Reynolds looked at me gravely. The contamination caused severe gastrointestinal issues in most of the victims, but we believe the toxins in some kits were more dangerous than others. The Chen family is currently in the hospital, but they're stable. Others haven't been so lucky. The room seemed to spin for a moment as his words sank in. Families were in the hospital, people I delivered to, people who had trusted me. I thought about the Chen kids, always laughing and playing whenever I dropped off their food. The thought of them lying sick in a hospital bed made my stomach churn. "Is there anything else I can do to help?" I asked, feeling helpless but desperate to do something, anything, to make up for what had happened. Dr. Reynolds nodded. "We're going to need you to help identify other customers who may have been targeted. We'll cross-check the complaints against Bennett's delivery records, but your first-hand knowledge of the families could help us pinpoint other victims." I agreed, though the idea of reliving my delivery routes, knowing that I had unknowingly delivered poison to people's homes, filled me with dread. I spent the next few hours with Dr. Reynolds and his team, going over every detail of my recent deliveries. We cross-referenced customer complaints, matched addresses, and tried to figure out who else might be at risk. Over the next couple of days, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the faces of the families I had delivered to, wondering if they were okay, if they had gotten sick or worse. The weight of it all pressed down on me, and I couldn't shake the guilt that gnawed at my insides. Then, 3 days after the call from Dr. Reynolds, I got a message, "Suspect apprehended." I felt a flood of relief, but it was short-lived. While Bennett had been caught, the damage had already been done. He was arrested at a bus station trying to flee the city, and from what I heard, he didn't resist. During questioning, he admitted to tampering with the meal kits, carefully selecting which families to target based on their complaints against him. It was all so petty. A man's bruised ego had turned into a vendetta that left families sick and traumatized. A few days after Bennett's arrest, I visited the hospital to check on the Chen family. I didn't know if they'd want to see me, considering everything that had happened, but I had to try. I couldn't just move on without knowing how they were doing. When I walked into the hospital room, Mrs. Chen was sitting by her son's bedside, her eyes tired but alert. Her daughter was in the bed beside him, both kids looking pale and weak, but at least they were awake. Mrs. Chen looked up as I entered the room, and for a moment we just stared at each other. I didn't know what to say. What could I say? "I'm so sorry," I finally blurted out, my voice barely a whisper. I didn't know what was happening. If I had, Mrs. Chen shook her head, cutting me off. "It's not your fault, Samantha. None of this is your fault." I wanted to believe her, but the guilt still weighed heavily on me. I should have noticed something was wrong with that delivery. I should have. "You couldn't have known," she said firmly. "We don't blame you." Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes and I blinked them away. "How are the kids?" Mrs. Chen smiled softly, though there was sadness in her eyes. "They're doing better. The doctor said they'll be okay, but it's going to take some time." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I'm so glad to hear that." We talked for a little while longer, and as I left the hospital room, I felt a small sense of relief. The Chens didn't blame me, but I knew it would take a long time before I could forgive myself for what had happened. Weeks passed, and the story of the contaminated meal kits became a headline in the news. People were outraged, demanding answers from the meal kit company and calling for stricter regulations on food safety. The company issued a public apology, and an investigation into their hiring practices was launched. As for me, I couldn't keep delivering meal kits after that. Every time I picked up a box, I felt a wave of anxiety wash over me, and I couldn't stop thinking about Bennett and what he had done. The guilt still lingered, even though I knew logically that I wasn't responsible. I had been part of something terrible, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had let those families down. I ended up leaving the job and finding something else, something that didn't involve delivering food to people's homes. But I'll never forget the Chen family, or the look on Mr. Chen's face when I handed him that box of food, not knowing that it held more than just ingredients for a family dinner. And I'll never forget the lesson I learned. Even the most ordinary jobs can sometimes lead to extraordinary consequences, ones you'd never see coming. I've always liked working as a courier. Sure, it's risky at times, especially when you're dealing with high-value items, but it keeps things interesting. I work for a company called SecureTrack, a high-security delivery service that caters to wealthy clients who want to move their valuables without a trace. It's not the usual gig where you're dropping off a package at someone's doorstep. No, this is a lot more intense. Every delivery comes with strict rules, specialized equipment, and sometimes a gut feeling that you might be walking into something bigger than you can handle. But nothing I'd done before compared to what happened last month. That one delivery that turned everything upside down. It started like any other job. I was given an assignment early in the morning, a lockbox valued in the millions, to be delivered to a man named Mr. Reeves at One Ocean Drive in Miami Beach. He was one of those clients who like to stay off the radar, which wasn't unusual in my line of work. The box wasn't large, maybe about the size of a briefcase, but it was heavy, more than I expected for something that small. I was instructed not to ask questions as usual and to deliver it directly to Mr. Reeves. No detours, no opening the box, no letting it out of my sight. Simple enough, I thought. The drive through Miami was as hectic as always, the traffic barely moving as the sun glared down on the ocean. I had my mind set on the drop-off, but halfway there, I noticed something strange. A black SUV was following me. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence. There are plenty of black SUVs in Miami, especially around the wealthier areas. But this one wasn't just behind me, it was matching my every turn. The SUV wasn't overtaking me, but it wasn't letting me get too far ahead either. My instincts kicked in. This wasn't normal. I took a couple of extra turns off the main route just to see if they'd follow. And sure enough, they did. That's when my stomach dropped. Someone was definitely tracking me, and I had no idea why. I pulled over into a small parking lot near Little Havana, trying to keep calm. I watched the SUV pull over too, a few spaces down. The windows were tinted, so I couldn't see who was inside, but whoever it was didn't get out. My phone buzzed. It was my boss from SecureTrack, reminding me to stay on schedule. I decided not to mention the tail. SecureTrack prided itself on discretion, and I figured I could handle it on my own, for now, at least. I got back on the road, keeping one eye on the SUV, trying to act like I wasn't spooked. But something was definitely off about this delivery. When I reached One Ocean Drive, Mr. Reeves's mansion looked just as you'd expect. Huge, secluded, and guarded by an iron gate with security cameras in every direction. The whole place screamed old money. I pulled up to the gate and buzzed in, trying to shake the nervous feeling creeping up my spine. After a few moments, the gate opened, and a man, mid-50s, impeccably dressed with silver hair, greeted me. This had to be Mr. Reeves. "You're here with the delivery?" he asked, eyeing the lockbox in my hands. "Yeah, it's all here," I replied, holding up the box. But as I handed it over, something about his expression changed. His eyes narrowed, just for a second, like he was trying to decide if he trusted me. "You were followed," he said quietly. My blood went cold. "How do you know?" He glanced toward the gate where the SUV had stopped just outside the property line. They've been watching me for a while now, he muttered, taking the box from my hands. But this makes things complicated. I didn't know what to say. As a courier, I wasn't supposed to get involved. I deliver the package, collect my pay, and leave. But something about the situation felt different. I couldn't just walk away. Mr. Reeves, I started, my voice barely steady. What's in the box? He shot me a hard look, clearly not happy with the question. It's not your concern. I opened my mouth to argue, but before I could, the sound of tires screeching made me turn around. The black SUV had pulled up, and two men in dark suits stepped out. They weren't here to negotiate. We need to go inside, now, Reeves said, his voice sharp with urgency. The next few minutes were a blur. Reeves led me inside his mansion, locking the doors behind us. The men from the SUV banged on the gate, shouting something I couldn't make out, but it didn't sound friendly. Who are they? I demanded, my nerves frayed. Reeves set the lockbox on a marble table and turned to face me, his calm demeanor slipping for the first time. They work for a rival, someone who wants what's in this box. What is it? I asked again, louder this time. Reeves sighed, running a hand through his silver hair. Evidence that clears my name. Clears your name? I echoed, confused. He nodded. I've been framed. Someone's been stealing art, valuable pieces, and selling them on the black market. I've been under investigation for months, but I had nothing to do with it. What's in this box? It proves who the real thief is. I stared at him, my heart racing. Then why don't you just go to the police? Reeves gave a bitter laugh. Do you think they'd believe me? The man framing me has connections, powerful ones. If I go to the police without solid proof, I'll be buried before I even get a chance to defend myself. So what now? I asked, glancing nervously toward the windows. The men outside weren't giving up. Reeves picked up the lockbox again, his expression grim. I need to get this box to a private marina. There's someone there who can help me get out of the country, at least until I can prove my innocence. Before I could respond, there was a loud crash. The men outside had broken through the gate. Reeves didn't waste any time. Come with me, he said, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the back of the mansion. We rushed through the sprawling house, finally emerging through a back door that led to a narrow alleyway. Parked there was another car, a sleek, black sedan. Reeves opened the back door and shoved the lockbox inside. Get in, he said, his voice low and urgent. You've gotten this far. You might as well see it through. I hesitated for a second, glancing back at the mansion. The men were getting closer, and I knew if I didn't leave now, they'd find me. I didn't have a choice. The drive to the marina was tense. Reeves stayed silent, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. I kept looking behind us, half expecting the black SUV to appear at any moment. We pulled into a small, private marina just as the sun was beginning to set. The air smelled of salt and gasoline, and the only sounds were the faint creaking of boats swaying in the water. A single yacht was docked at the end of the pier, its sleek, white exterior gleaming under the fading light. This is it, Reeves said quietly, getting out of the car. He motioned for me to follow as he grabbed the lockbox from the back seat. As we approached the yacht, a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out from the cabin. He had a military look about him, with short-cropped hair and sharp, calculating eyes. You made it, the man said to Reeves, his voice gravelly. Reeves nodded, handing over the lockbox. Everything you need is in there. The man glanced at me, his expression unreadable. And who's Tess? Just a courier, Reeves said quickly. She doesn't know anything. I wanted to argue, to tell him I knew more than I should, but before I could, I heard a familiar voice behind me. Freeze. Step away from the box. I turned to see Agent Carter, someone I recognized from a few other deliveries I'd made to customs, standing at the end of the pier, a gun drawn and aimed at Reeves. What the hell is going on here? I muttered, my heart pounding. Step away from the box, Sophia, Carter ordered, his voice cold. Reeves looked at me, his eyes filled with desperation. Don't listen to him. He's with them. He's part of the cover-up. Carter didn't flinch. That box contains stolen art, and you're both under investigation. Everything was happening too fast. I didn't know who to trust, and the weight of the situation was finally crashing down on me. I had been dragged into something far beyond a simple delivery. Reeves stepped forward, placing a hand on the box. "You don't understand. This box proves I was framed. If you take it now, they'll bury the evidence, and I'll take the fall." Carter's grip on his gun tightened. "Hand it over, Reeves. It's over." The tension was suffocating. The only sound was the soft lapping of water against the docks and the distant hum of a boat engine in the marina. My mind was racing, trying to process everything. Reeves stood frozen, his hand still on the lockbox, but I could see the fear in his eyes. He wasn't lying about being scared, but was he telling the truth about being framed? I had no idea who to trust, but I knew one thing: whatever was in that box was important enough to risk everything. "Think, Sophia," Carter said, his eyes never leaving Reeves. "He's playing you. The art thefts, the missing pieces, they all lead back to him. We have evidence." Reeves turned to me, his voice desperate. "Sophia, you've seen enough to know something's wrong. The people chasing us? They work for the real thief, not the law. If you let Carter take that box, I'll be arrested, and they'll get away with it." I felt paralyzed, my pulse hammering in my ears. Both of them seemed so sure, so convincing, but I had no way of knowing who was telling the truth. I was just a courier, a middleman who had somehow gotten tangled in something way beyond my pay grade. Before I could make a decision, the man from the yacht, the one Reeves had been talking to, stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "You've got two choices," he said, his voice calm but menacing. "You hand that box over, or this whole thing goes sideways real fast." Carter shifted slightly, the tension in his posture growing. "I'm not negotiating. Step back, or I will fire." The man didn't move. I could feel the situation spiraling out of control, and all I wanted to do was get out of there. But I knew if I made the wrong move, things could turn deadly. Suddenly, Reeves made a grab for the lockbox, yanking it from the yacht man's hands and turning to run. Carter shouted, and everything happened in a blur. The sound of gunfire split the air, followed by a scream. I ducked instinctively, my heart pounding in my chest. When I looked up, Reeves was on the ground, clutching his side, blood seeping through his fingers. "Don't move," Carter yelled, rushing forward, gun still drawn. The man from the yacht cursed under his breath and backed away, hands raised in surrender. It all happened so fast that I barely had time to process what had just gone down. Reeves lay there, gasping for breath, his eyes locked on the lockbox that had fallen a few feet away. "Please," he whispered, his voice weak, "open the box. It's the only way you'll know the truth." I hesitated, glancing at Carter. He shook his head. "Don't do it, Sophia. That box is evidence. Let us handle it." But something inside me wouldn't let it go. Everything Reeves had said up until now might have been a lie, but I needed to know. I needed to see what was inside that box. Ignoring Carter's protests, I stepped forward, my hands trembling as I picked up the lockbox. It was cold and heavier than it looked, the weight of it sending a shiver through me. I found the latch and flipped it open, the lock clicking with a soft metallic sound. Inside, there wasn't stolen art or cash like I had half expected. Instead, there were photographs, dozens of them. They were all images of expensive paintings, sculptures, and rare artifacts. Some of the photos showed the pieces displayed in luxurious homes, while others showed them in warehouses, packaged for transport. But what caught my attention were the documents underneath the photos. One was a signed agreement between high-profile collectors, including the name of the rival Reeves had mentioned, a man known for his dealings in the black market. The other documents were correspondence between that rival and someone inside the Miami Police Department, an inside man. This wasn't just about stolen art. This was about a conspiracy to frame Reeves while the real thieves made off with the profits. Reeves had been telling the truth all along. I looked up at Carter, my heart pounding. This proves everything. He's innocent. Carter's face hardened, and for a moment, I saw something shift in his expression, something darker. "That doesn't change anything, Sophia. You shouldn't have opened that box." I blinked, confused. But this is evidence. We can use it to take down the real criminals. Carter shook his head slowly. No, we can't. Realization hit me like a freight train. Carter wasn't here to arrest Reeves. He was part of it, part of the same conspiracy to cover up the thefts and pin it all on Reeves. I had been so blind, thinking I could trust him just because he wore a badge. I backed up, clutching the lockbox. You're in on it, aren't you? Carter's expression darkened, and he slowly raised his gun again. Sophia, give me the box. You don't understand what you're getting into. No, I said, my voice shaking but firm. You're not getting away with this. In a split-second decision, I turned and ran toward the yacht. I could hear Carter shouting behind me, but I didn't look back. The man from the yacht was still standing near the cabin, and as I approached, I could see him weighing his options. Get this boat moving, I yelled. Now. He hesitated for a moment, but then he jumped into action, running for the controls. The engine roared to life just as Carter reached the dock, his gun aimed at me. Shots rang out, but they missed, and the boat began to pull away from the marina. I collapsed against the railing, clutching the lockbox to my chest. My heart was racing, and my mind was spinning. I didn't know what the hell I was going to do next, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let them get away with it. Reeves had risked everything to clear his name, and now it was up to me to make sure the truth came out. We managed to make it out to open water, far enough away from the marina that Carter couldn't reach us. The man from the yacht, his name was Victor, I learned, wasn't exactly a saint, but he had no interest in being part of a conspiracy that would get him killed. Over the next few days, I worked with Victor to contact a journalist I knew, someone who could help expose the whole operation. With the photos and documents from the lockbox, we had all the proof we needed to bring down the real criminals, including the corrupt cops who were in on the scheme. As for Carter, I never saw him again after that night. I heard through the grapevine that he vanished shortly after the story broke, his name forever tied to the scandal that rocked Miami's elite. Looking back on it now, I realize how close I came to losing everything that night. I was just a courier, a middleman caught in the crossfire of something much bigger than I ever imagined. But in the end, I did what I had to do. I don't work for Secure Track anymore. After everything that happened, I needed a break from that world. But I still think about it sometimes, about the lockbox, about the lies, about the moment I realized I couldn't trust anyone. And every time I see a black SUV in my rearview mirror, I wonder if maybe, just maybe, there's still someone out there watching. Because in this line of work, you never really know when it's over.
I've been a courier in New York City for over 5 years, delivering packages to all sorts of people. Busy professionals, rich execs, families, students. You name it, I've probably handed them a box. Most of the time, it's just a mundane routine. You don't really think too much about the lives you're crossing paths with. But there's one delivery that I'll never forget. One that went from ordinary to terrifying in the blink of an eye. It all started on an early Thursday morning. I had my usual route, starting at the Empire State Building, delivering to several addresses in Midtown. It was mid-autumn, and the streets were bustling with tourists and commuters, just like any other day. My next stop was at Alicia Ramirez's apartment building, an upscale place near Madison Avenue. I had delivered there a few times before. Alicia was always polite, a bit quiet, kept to herself. I knocked on her door that day, and after a moment, Alicia opened it, smiling faintly like she always did. She was a petite woman, with dark hair pulled into a loose ponytail. But something was off this time. Her eyes darted around and she seemed more anxious than usual, like she was expecting something or someone. "Hey, Marcus. Thanks for the delivery," she said, her voice tight. "Sure thing, Alicia. You all right?" I asked, noticing the nervous energy. She gave me a weak smile and shrugged. "Yeah, just tired, I guess." I handed her the package, and as soon as it touched her hands, her expression shifted. Her smile faded completely, and she stared at the box like it was some kind of bomb. "You okay?" I asked again, this time more concerned. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just... sorry, it's nothing." She took a deep breath and forced a smile. "Thanks again." I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I left her building, but I couldn't stop thinking about how tense she seemed. I didn't think much of it at the time. People have bad days after all. But looking back, that was the first sign. The next day, I had another package for her. This one was even smaller than the last, about the size of a shoebox, and heavier. When I arrived at her door, she looked even worse than before. Dark circles under her eyes, her face pale. It looked like she hadn't slept at all. "Alicia?" I hesitated before handing the package over. "You good?" She didn't answer right away. Her eyes were fixed on the box, and she reached out for it with shaking hands. Yeah. Just a rough couple of days," she murmured. But there was something else in her voice. Fear. I watched her as she set the box down on the table in her apartment's hallway, but her eyes never left it. It was like she was afraid to touch it. "Alicia, seriously, what's going on?" She finally looked up at me, her lips trembling. "Marcus, do you know who's sending these?" I blinked, taken aback by the question. "I don't. I just get them from the warehouse. They don't have a return address?" She shook her head slowly. "No, none. And the contents, they're..." Her voice trailed off, and she looked away. "The contents?" I pressed. She sighed, then glanced back at the box. "They're personal. Someone is sending me things from my past, things I've forgotten about." Now I was intrigued, and more than a little disturbed. "What do you mean, things from your past?" Alicia hesitated for a long moment before speaking again. "The first package had photos, old family photos, but not normal ones. These were pictures I've never seen before, pictures of me as a child. And there was a note too. It said, 'Remember me?'" A chill ran down my spine. "And you don't know who it's from?" "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But whoever it is, they know things about me, things no one else should know." I was no detective, but it was clear that someone was playing a sick game with her. "Have you called the police?" She bit her lip, looking down at her feet. I was thinking about it, but what can they do? They'll just say it's some prank. I don't have proof that it's anything serious. I sighed, knowing she was probably right. The NYPD wasn't going to launch a full-scale investigation over some creepy packages. But still, something about this felt off. Really off. "I can help you, Alicia," I offered. "I don't know much, but I can keep an eye out at the warehouse. Maybe see if anything seems off with your deliveries." She looked at me, her eyes wide with gratitude. "Thank you, Marcus. I don't know what's happening, but I feel like it's just beginning." Over the next few days, more packages arrived. Each one smaller than the last. Each one more unnerving than the previous. One contained an old necklace Alicia had lost when she was a teenager, something she said she hadn't seen in years. Another held a pair of childhood shoes, worn and faded. Each time I delivered them, Alicia grew more agitated, more afraid. She began checking her door constantly, locking and unlocking it, like she was expecting someone to break in at any moment. I couldn't blame her. The packages were like a countdown, ticking toward something terrible. Then, about a week later, I showed up at her door with the smallest package yet. A tiny box, just big enough to hold something the size of a ring or key. Alicia looked at it like it was the final piece of some horrifying puzzle. When she opened the box, her face went pale. Inside was a single Polaroid picture. It was of her, as a baby, in a hospital bassinet. But what made my skin crawl was the writing at the bottom of the photo, scrawled in red ink, "I've always been watching." That's when Alicia finally called the police. Detective Johnson was assigned to the case. He was an older guy, probably in his late 50s, with a no-nonsense attitude. He asked me a few questions about the deliveries, but I didn't have much to offer. Everything had come through the usual channels. No one suspicious, no return addresses, nothing that stood out. "I'll look into it," Johnson said. But I could tell he wasn't convinced this was anything more than a twisted prank. Probably some stalker who's gotten a hold of her personal info. We'll get to the bottom of it. But Alicia and I both knew this wasn't just some random stalker. Whoever was sending these packages knew too much about her life, things no one else could possibly know. It was personal. Then the final package arrived. It was late on a Saturday night when I got a call from Alicia. She was crying, her voice frantic. "Marcus, there's another package. It's her." "Her?" I asked, confused. "My sister, my twin sister." I was stunned. Alicia had never mentioned a sister before, let alone a twin. "What are you talking about?" She sniffled, trying to compose herself. "I never told you. I never told anyone. When we were born, my parents put my sister up for adoption. They couldn't afford to keep both of us, so they kept me and gave her away. I've never met her, never even known what happened to her." "And you think she's the one sending the packages?" "Yes," Alicia whispered. "The photo, the necklace, the shoes, all of it. They were hers, not mine." My heart raced as I tried to process what she was saying. It made sense, in a terrifying way. But why now? Why was her sister resurfacing after all these years? And why in such a twisted manner? "What did the package say?" I asked. "There was a letter," Alicia replied, her voice shaking. "It said, 'You took everything from me. Now it's your turn to lose.'" I felt a cold chill run down my spine. "Where is the package now?" "I haven't touched it. I called the police, but I don't know if they'll get here in time." "Stay where you are. I'm coming over," I said, grabbing my jacket and rushing out the door. When I got to Alicia's apartment, Detective Johnson was already there, his team combing through the place. The package was on the kitchen table, unopened except for the letter Alicia had read. I could see it, sitting there ominously, as though it held some dark secret we weren't ready to uncover. "This is a family matter," Johnson muttered, shaking his head. "Estranged siblings can get weird, but this is more than just a grudge." As we stood there, the phone rang. Alicia answered, her face going white as she listened. She didn't say anything, just stared at me, then at the detective. After a long pause, she handed the phone to Johnson. "It's her," she whispered. Johnson took the phone, but I could tell from the look on his face that the conversation wasn't going the way he'd expected. When he hung up, his expression was grim. Detective Johnson set the phone down slowly, his face tight with concern. "She says she's nearby, watching. Claims she's been tracking Alicia for months, waiting for the right moment to reveal herself." Alicia's hand went to her mouth, her breath catching. "She's watching, ma'am," Johnson nodded. "She didn't say where exactly, but she's been keeping tabs on you. And this isn't just about sending packages. She wants more." My stomach twisted as I realized the situation was much more dangerous than I'd imagined. "What does she want?" I asked, my voice low, the weight of the moment pressing down on all of us. "She wants revenge," Johnson said, his eyes narrowing, "for being abandoned. She thinks Alicia has had the life she was supposed to have." Alicia was shaking now, tears welling up in her eyes. "But I didn't know. I didn't even know she existed until these packages started showing up." "She doesn't care," Johnson said gravely. "She feels like you stole her life." As we stood there, trying to figure out what to do next, a sudden loud knock echoed through the apartment. Alicia gasped, and we all froze, staring at the door. Detective Johnson motioned for us to stay back as he slowly approached, his hand resting on his holstered gun. "Who is it?" he called out, his voice steady but firm. There was a long, eerie silence, and then a woman's voice came from the other side. "It's me," Alicia's face went pale. That's her. My sister. I felt my heart pound harder in my chest. What was she going to do? Was she here to hurt Alicia? Johnson motioned for us to stay put as he cracked the door open just enough to see who was on the other side. Standing in the hallway was a woman who looked almost exactly like Alicia. Same dark hair, same small frame. But there was something different about her. Her face was harder, her eyes cold and empty. "Can I come in?" she asked calmly, as though she were a friendly neighbor dropping by for a visit. There was no emotion in her voice, just an unsettling flat tone. Johnson didn't move. "I think you've done enough damage. Why don't you tell us what you want?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I just want to talk to my sister. I think she owes me that." Alicia took a step forward, trembling. "Why are you doing this?" Her sister's expression darkened, her voice lowering to a growl. "Because you took everything from me. I didn't even know you existed," Alicia cried, tears streaming down her face. "I was a baby. I didn't make that decision." Her sister's eyes flared with anger. "That's not the point. You lived a life I was supposed to have. Parents who loved you, a home, an education, a future. All while I was shuffled from one foster home to another, never feeling like I belonged anywhere." Johnson stepped between the door and Alicia, his hand still on his gun. "We can talk about this calmly, but I'm going to need you to stay right there." Her sister laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. "You don't get it, do you? I've been planning this for years. I've watched Alicia for so long, waiting for the right moment to make her understand what it's like to have everything ripped away. I'm not here for some chat." I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't just a family dispute. She had come to hurt Alicia. Johnson must have sensed it too, because he motioned for backup through the radio on his shoulder. "Stay where you are," he ordered her, his voice firm. But before he could act, her sister lunged forward, slamming the door open with a force I hadn't expected from someone so small. Johnson was caught off guard, but he reacted quickly, drawing his gun and stepping back. Alicia screamed as her sister rushed toward her, but I moved without thinking, grabbing Alicia and pulling her behind me. "Stop!" Johnson yelled, his gun aimed at her. "Don't move another step." Her sister froze, glaring at all of us, her eyes wild. "You think you can protect her? She's been hiding behind people like you her whole life." "That's enough," Johnson shouted, stepping forward, his gun steady. "This ends now. You're under arrest." Her sister's face twisted with rage. "You don't know what it's like to live in my shadow." I could feel Alicia shaking behind me, her breath quick and shallow. "Please, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." For a moment, her sister hesitated, the anger flickering in her eyes. But then she smiled again, that same cold, empty smile. "You will. I'll make sure of it." And just like that, she bolted, sprinting down the hallway, disappearing into the stairwell before Johnson could stop her. "Damn it," Johnson cursed, running after her. The next few hours were a blur. Police swarmed the building, searching for Alicia's sister, but she was gone. Disappeared into the city, like a ghost. Detective Johnson stayed with us, making sure Alicia was safe, but the fear lingered. Alicia was shaken to her core, unable to comprehend how someone so close, yet so distant, had come into her life with such hatred. We sat together in silence, waiting for updates from the police. "She'll come back," Alicia whispered, her voice hollow. "I know she will." Johnson nodded, his face grim. "We'll be ready for her. She can't hide forever." Weeks passed, and there was no sign of Alicia's sister. The packages stopped, the phone calls ceased, and for a while, it seemed like maybe she had given up. But I knew better. Someone with that much anger doesn't just let go. Alicia eventually moved out of her apartment, relocating to a new address under a different name. Johnson had convinced her it was the safest option, to start fresh somewhere else. far away from the shadows of her sister's rage. As for me, I went back to work, delivering packages to new faces, new places. But every time I knocked on a door, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beneath the surface. That somewhere out there, Alicia's sister was still watching, still waiting for her chance to finish what she started. And sometimes, late at night, when the city is quiet and the streets are empty, I wonder if I'll ever cross paths with her again.